The metallic contractions of the cooling cast iron echoed from the wood stove, making a distinct rhythmic clicking sound as the fire died down to embers. That steady cadence sounded like an internal countdown echoing through the structure. Standing barefoot on the wooden planks of the kitchen floor, I watched the low, amber glow of the failing kerosene lamp cast shifting shadows that seemed to breathe in the corners. It was sometime past 9 on a January evening, and I had neglected to add fuel to the light. Outside, a persistent winter wind pressed firmly against the exterior siding, carrying that heavy, unyielding quality of a deep seasonal freeze rather than a brief storm. Our nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away across a blanket of snow, a distance I had not traversed in 3 days. From the bedroom directly above, the distinct sound of his boots hitting the floor signaled his arrival, followed by the familiar, precise alignment of heel against heel by the entryway. Without turning around, I kept my hand braced on the back of a kitchen chair, listening intently as the house settled around me like a slow, closing trap amid the ticking stove and the faint hiss of the lamp. I need to explain the nature of that house, the specific toll that winter takes on a marriage when isolation leaves no alternative path, and the precise 2 evenings when I abandoned the lie that I was blind to my own reality. Before detailing how this path began, I must speak plainly to those listening. These accounts bring to light the private realities meant to remain forever concealed behind closed doors. If you have sought out these perspectives before, you recognize this atmosphere, and if you are arriving for the first time, I encourage you to remain engaged, because the trajectory of this journey defies expectations from its very beginning to its final moments. If a specific sound from your past still causes your muscles to freeze, whether a particular vibration, an unsettling creak, or a heavy, ominous quiet, I invite you to document just that specific sound in the space below. By naming that sensory memory, you will find you are far from alone. When our paths first crossed, the autumn air carried the crisp scent of harvested fields and the initial touch of October frost. The community had gathered for a barn raising on the Yoder farm, laboring from the first light of dawn until the sun dipped below the horizon. As evening fell, the older generation moved indoors to dine, while the youth congregated near the transport wagons. He sat on the edge of a hay wagon with his shirt sleeves turned up and his suspenders hanging loosely over his shoulders, pointedly looking away from me while remaining acutely aware of my presence. It was a directional warmth, noticeable in the way one perceives the glow of a lamp without looking directly at it. His name is irrelevant to what occurred. What mattered were his large, calloused palms, shaped by physical labor that begins long before a youth learns to articulate his purpose. When he gently rested his hand over mine against the weathered wood of the wagon, the motion carried an intensity that felt nearly painful in its caution. There was no forceful gripping or pulling, only a deliberate placement, as if he were handling a fragile object he feared might shatter. Below us lay the dry, golden stalks of hay, warmed by his skin, while a horse nearby shifted its weight and let out a long, slow breath. I found comfort in the sound of his voice initially, a detail that requires emphasis because of how distorted everything became later, and it is vital to understand that our beginnings lacked that distortion. He spoke softly of his aspirations for a homestead, detailing plans for a kitchen oriented to the southern sun, a wood stove substantial enough to warm the entire ground floor, and a porch designed for summer nights. He articulated these dreams with the simultaneous pride and modesty of a young boy showcasing a treasured drawing, convincing a 19-year-old girl that this was her destined path. I believed a life with a quiet man, a sturdy porch, and a reliable stove was exactly what I wanted. At 19 and 21, our ages were perfectly aligned with the expectations of our community, where marriage was viewed as the ultimate destination toward which every individual life path naturally converged. The preparation for a young woman entering this union was absolute and uncomplicated. You exist as his companion, you defer to his guidance, and you yield because the hierarchy is divinely ordained and beyond your right to dispute. The community applied the concept of submission with an artificial softness, presenting it as a form of sanctuary, akin to resting after an exhausting day of labor. Yet no one warns you that the labor is unceasing. Our courtship progressed along the traditional, heavily monitored boundaries, consisting primarily of the journey home from youth singings in his open buggy, shielded by a heavy woolen lap blanket against the biting wind as his shoulder pressed near mine. Physical contact was strictly limited to what was visible and socially sanctioned, his hand resting briefly on mine, or his arm draped across my shoulders a single time during our travels. I interpreted that heavy, solid presence as a promise of security, a misconception I believe he shared. He was no more aware of the role he was being shaped to fulfill than I was aware of the compliance I was being conditioned to exhibit. Our wedding took place on a Tuesday in November, filling the house with guests, abundant food, and low, resonant hymns that echoed like wind moving through timber. Clad in a blue bridal dress rather than white, I felt my mother's tear-stained, radiant face near mine as she clasped my hands and assured me of my future happiness. She spoke without deceit, merely passing down the ancient, unexamined assurance of her own mother and generations before her, a heavy, familiar tradition accepted without question. The initial winter descended abruptly, locking the earth in frost by the middle of December, under a low, leaden sky that extinguished the pale daylight by mid-afternoon. This marked the beginning of those protracted nights that define this account, nights that altered my understanding in ways my physical body anticipated long before my conscious mind could articulate the shift. Like an animal sensing an approaching storm through a change in atmospheric pressure, an internal tension took hold, and my perception altered. Our sleeping quarters were confined, featuring a single window so heavily obscured by morning frost that the barn outside was invisible. A kerosene lamp sat on the chest of drawers, dimmed to a mere pinprick of light before sleep, while my mother's hand-stitched wedding quilt, a heavy, double-ring pattern of blue and cream fabric, pressed down upon us like an added weight. By the entryway, his boots remained precisely aligned, heel to heel, embodying the exact orderliness I had once found comforting, while the ticking of the downstairs stove vibrated through the floorboards, a sound as intimately familiar to me as my own identity. On the first night that remains permanently etched in my memory, I lay awake in the absolute blackness unique to a home devoid of electricity or external light, listening to his steady breathing. The air above our covers felt like a sheet of ice, contrasting sharply with the heat radiating from his body beneath the heavy layers. When he moved toward me, there was no dialogue, no inquiry, and no space for consent to exist. There was only an action, an entitlement that occurred with the same routine certainty as stoking the fire or tending to the livestock. It was entirely mundane and mechanical. I remained motionless during the act and stayed still long after it concluded, fixed in the same position in the dark as the stove clicked below. Inside, however, a subtle dislocation occurred, a fractional shift resembling a bone slipping quietly out of alignment, where the true pain is deferred until much later. I rationalized the experience as the reality of marriage, pulling my mother's quilt to my chin and remembering that my grandmother had endured her winters under the exact same fabric. Without conscious intent, I began to keep count. Between those two winters came a summer marked by a communal canning day at the bishop's residence in August. The intense heat inside the kitchen caused the windows to stream with condensation, filling the air with a thick vapor of sugar, vinegar, and the sharp scent of peach skins rupturing in cauldrons of boiling water. 8 women labored shoulder to shoulder along the workspace, their movements synchronized in a repetitive sequence of peeling, slicing, packing, and sealing. Rows of prepared jars lined the tables like rigid glass regiments awaiting their contents, while a lone fly battered against the window screen. The brick propping open the rear door offered no relief against the oppressive heat radiating from the cook stove, the crowded room, and the midsummer sun beating down on the roof. Survival meant simply enduring the labor within it. As one of the youngest women present, I struggled to match their efficiency, my clumsy handling causing me to bruise the soft fruit by gripping the paring knife too tightly and pressing my thumbs into the delicate flesh. To correct my technique, I observed the bishop's wife working beside me. Though her precise age was obscured by a lifetime of hard labor, her swift, dry hands operated independently of her gaze, much like an experienced musician navigating a keyboard by touch. She stripped a peach clean in 3 fluid strokes, the blade making a faint whispering sound against the skin. She maintained her silent focus for most of the morning until the room shifted toward midday, as others began preparing bread and cold meats, and the industrious silence dissolved into casual gossip about children, gardens, and injured livestock. Amid this ordinary chatter, the bishop's wife uttered a quiet observation, directed not to me or any specific individual, but seemingly to the fruit, the steam, or the 3 decades she had spent at that counter. She remarked that one learns to detach the mind when the physical body is the entity being claimed. She delivered the statement with the flat, indifferent delivery one uses to project rain, before immediately reaching for the next peach. No one offered a response, and given the ambient noise of clinking glass and chatter, it is likely no one else noted the remark. It was a sentence meant to dissolve unnoticed into the humidity of the kitchen, yet it struck me with the unsettling clarity of a wrong sound in the night, like a snapping branch or an unfastened door that triggers an instinctual alertness before the mind can rationalize the danger. I stood motionless, a damaged peach resting in my hand, as the sticky juices ran through my fingers, feeling a sudden internal unlocking, like an old cabinet door forced open after being sealed shut by layers of paint. She never glanced my way, nor did she need to. She had released an idea into the room that settled deeply within me, becoming a permanent part of my consciousness. I harbored that single sentence throughout the remainder of the warm months and into the autumn, speaking of it to no one, storing it away internally like a sealed jar of provisions not yet ready for consumption. Lacking the vocabulary to define its meaning, I only knew my physical self understood its truth ahead of my intellect, causing my body to brace itself differently as the daylight waned, the darkness lengthened, and the bedroom door closed for the evening. The arrival of the second winter manifested as an atmospheric pressure, sensed the way livestock anticipate an oncoming blizzard before the first flakes fall. When the second defining night arrived, it occurred in the identical setting, and I emphasized the exactness of that room, which possessed the rigid permanence of a recurring nightmare. The window, the frost patterns, and the blue and cream double-ring quilt, now faded and softened by 2 seasons of friction, remained unchanged. His boots stood heel to heel by the entrance, the lamp was dimmed to extinction, and the downstairs stove maintained its relentless countdown. Tick, tick. The sensory details were indistinguishable from any other night at that hour in that house, but the woman inhabiting the bed had been transformed. I now carried the words of the bishop's wife within me, alongside the sound of my young daughter's rhythmic breathing through the thin partition of the adjacent room, that fragile, rapid respiration of a child, entirely unaware of peril. I will omit the specific details of that encounter. Anyone who has inhabited that specific darkness already comprehends what it entails, and to those who have not, descriptions would only diminish the magnitude of the experience. Instead, I will recall the sounds that bracketed the event. The specific creak of the wooden bed frame as he turned toward me, a high-pitched, thin protest from the timber that functioned like a question requiring no answer, and the shifting weight of the blankets. Afterward came the sound of his retreat as his breathing shifted into the deep, unburdened rhythm of a body satisfied in its desires. I remained completely still, my eyes fixed on the absolute blackness, counting the intervals of the wood stove, the seconds between my daughter's breaths through the wall, and the web of ceiling fractures I had charted on previous nights. I tracked the prominent crack near the window, the split rising above the lamp, and the faint hairline fracture tracing from the corner toward the center like a path leading to a dead end. I engaged in this counting because the bishop's wife had provided a destination for my consciousness, and I had successfully located it. You retreat to a space directly behind your own eyes, standing in an imaginary field, or within the walls of an unbuilt home, or perhaps within total nothingness, allowing the numbers to drift you away like a leaf carried by a current, not toward a specific shore, but simply away from the present. This second realization surpassed the first in its severity, precisely because nothing had altered. The horror lay entirely in the continuity, the identical boots, the same fabric, the familiar creaking wood, the darkness, the approach, and the withdrawal. The first instance brought awareness. The second brought absolute knowledge, and entering the realm of knowledge changes a person entirely. Knowledge possesses a tangible weight and structure. It strips away the illusion that the morning light can erase the events of the night. As I lay listening to my daughter's breath, my thoughts fixed on the quilt stitched by my mother, using a pattern inherited from her mother, and her mother before her. I wondered how many generations of women had occupied these identical rooms under similar covers through endless winters, tracking structural defects in the plaster while waiting for the male breathing beside them to slacken so they could finally relax their clenched fingers beneath the sheets. How many women had internalized the bishop's wife's philosophy before it reached me? My mind turned to my daughter's hands, still soft and curled in the manner of an infant despite her 2 years of life, and I envisioned those hands maturing. I foresaw the community instilling the doctrine of submission within her, masking it as a form of peace, and I pictured her someday lying in a similar bed, counting to survive. That specific realization shattered my compliance, not with the dramatic uproar or theatrical declarations of independence found in fiction, but with the quiet finality of pond ice fracturing in early March. The breakdown begins from beneath, driven by a microscopic warming of the water that remains invisible until a sudden surface fissure appears, signaling that the structural integrity is gone. I did not move or flee that evening. I simply remained beneath the covers, possessing two absolute certainties. The cycle would repeat, but when it did, I would no longer be present in that room. The following morning at 5:30, I initiated the breakfast routine. The pre-dawn sky remained dark, but the external snow reflected a cold, monochromatic light through the window, rendering the kitchen with the flat, artificial stillness of an old photograph. I ignited the propane burner, its sharp, distinct hiss sounding like a more aggressive version of the kerosene lamp, and dropped 4 eggs into a searing iron skillet of butter. The children approached the table barefoot, navigating the same frigid floorboards that chilled my own feet, as I distributed plates, poured milk, and sliced bread with the mechanical precision of the bishop's wife handling fruit. Months of necessity had compressed decades of traditional training into my hands, proving that survival accelerates all learning. When he descended the staircase, the sound of his footsteps preceded him. He assumed his place at the table, eating while commenting on the dropping temperatures, the need for increased livestock feed, and his requirement for a packed lunch by 10 o'clock due to a fencing project at the Miller farm. His demeanor at the table was entirely decent. He passed the butter to our son and gently cleared a stray bit of egg from our daughter's chin with his thumb, utilizing the exact same careful tenderness I recalled from the hay wagon. That specific contradiction fueled my confusion for years afterward, the question of how an individual could exhibit such profound tenderness at a meal and such absolute vacancy in the marriage bed, or how the identical hands that comforted a child could take possession of my body in the dark without a single inquiry. He was not a malevolent person, and it is crucial to understand that he lacked cruelty. He was simply a product of a social structure that rendered consent irrelevant, having never once been prompted to evaluate the framework of his world. Behind him, I cleansed the tableware while he opened the stove door to replenish the fuel, the dry timber crackling as the fire intensified. As the radiant heat expanded through the room and the daily cycle resumed, I looked through the glass at the winter landscape and realized with absolute certainty that this would be the final season. I possessed no strategy, timeline, or understanding of the inevitable consequences, but the intent had taken root, much like the sentence spoken by the bishop's wife, developing silently in the privacy of my mind, where all dangerous transformations begin. My departure occurred in March, and I will recount it with the rapid pacing it occupied in my body, moving with a sudden, unvarnished numbness rather than theatrical deliberation. While he labored at the Miller homestead, I packed a solitary piece of luggage containing only essential garments for myself and the children, alongside a single book passed down from my grandmother. I chose to leave the quilt behind. Standing at the foot of the bed, I examined the blue and cream double ring pattern containing my mother's labor in every thread, and I left it undisturbed upon the mattress where it belonged. That omission constituted the most excruciating decision of that day, not the act of fleeing, but abandoning that artifact of my mother's life and her mother's design. I left an entire inheritance of unspoken endurance folded on that bed, descending the stairs without offering a final glance at the bedroom doorway. That afternoon marked my initial encounter with a telephone. Months earlier, a woman from an external town congregation, separate from our community, had pressed a slip of paper containing a contact number into my palm during a farmer's market, her expression indicating an awareness of my reality before I had even acknowledged it myself. I placed the call from a public phone enclosure located 2 miles from our property, my hands trembling so violently that I ruined the initial attempts to dial. A white transport van arrived bearing a structural dent in the side door, already equipped with an integrated child safety seat, an indication that an outsider had anticipated the needs of my children before our arrival. After securing my son and daughter inside, I joined them, and the vehicle turned onto the county highway. I stared out at the gray, compacted snow along the road shoulders and the infinite, flat white fields, experiencing an absolute void of emotion. I emphasize that feeling of absolute nothingness. The emotional impact arrived much later. The departure itself felt like wading through a heavy current, where every physical action was labored, slow, and divorced from auditory reality. I could observe my own hands fastening the safety harnesses, yet my fingertips possessed no sensation. I never returned, a fact I state plainly because the reality of the choice is absolute, even if the surrounding circumstances were convoluted. There followed months of residency in a temporary refuge characterized by the scent of harsh chemical cleaners and the collective sorrow of displaced women. I endured nights when my daughter pleaded for her familiar room, leaving me without an answer that did not inflict further internal damage, and I possessed correspondence from my mother that sat unsealed for weeks. When I finally read her words, they offered a simple plea to return home, utilizing the exact phrasing her own ancestors had likely used in times of crisis. The concept of home functioned like a concealed barb, tearing at me with every reading, yet I resisted the pull. The icy surface had ruptured, and the framework could no longer support my weight, regardless of any lingering desire for familiarity. As the months transitioned into a year, I secured employment performing domestic cleaning for non-Amish households, who treated me with the cautious benevolence reserved for an enigma they could not fully comprehend. I placed the children in the local educational system, where my son discovered the concept of electricity, repeating the word 17 times in a single afternoon like a newfound incantation. I severed my hair, an action that may seem insignificant, but carried immense weight after 26 years of preservation, concealment, and traditional head coverings. A stylist at a commercial plaza held the length of my braid in one hand and the shears in the other, requesting confirmation before proceeding, and my affirmative response brought the loudest sound I had experienced in months as the metal blades closed. Afterward, my head felt unburdened and unstable, resembling a balloon floating without a clear trajectory. Eventually, I found myself in a small consulting room defined by carpeting beneath my feet, a texture so unfamiliar after years of bare wood that my soul struggled to adapt to the compliance of the floor. The space featured a wall clock with a stark white face and black indicators that produced a distinct rhythmic ticking. The sound struck my chest with physical force, matching the exact rhythm and interval of the kitchen stove, the bedroom floorboards, and now, this therapist's office situated within a modern facility equipped with automated heating, harsh lighting, and an acoustic masking device outside the door. The cadence of my past had pursued me. Yet this specific environment offered warmth without combustion, lacked the presence of male footwear by the entrance, and provided a counselor who observed me without dictating my emotional responses. She requested that I isolate and detail a single evening rather than evaluating the entire marital history, the community structure, or the theological framework. In response, I articulated the anatomy of that bedroom, the covers, the frosted glass, the extinguished illumination, the precise alignment of the boots, the structural complaint of the bed frame, and the subsequent respiration. I explained the cartography of the ceiling imperfections, the system of counting, and the psychological retreat I utilized when my physical self was compromised. I recounted the incident with the bishop's wife, the fruit, and the climate-like delivery of her wisdom, followed by the routine of the next morning involving the food preparation, the burner's hiss, and the tender touch on my child's face. I revealed these memories in the order they occupied my consciousness, an order divorced from chronological sequence because human recollection organizes experiences by emotional gravity rather than calendar dates. She remained silent throughout the delivery, offering no interruptions. Upon my conclusion, a protracted quiet ensued, filled only by the mechanical advance of the wall clock and the steady hum of the acoustic machine, before she articulated a concept entirely foreign to my vocabulary, identifying the dynamic as coercive control. She pronounced the phrase deliberately, with the gravity one employs when introducing two individuals whose acquaintance is long overdue. If this account of survival and awakening has resonated with your own journey, consider sharing these insights with someone who may currently need to find their own path out of the dark.